Hey, how's it going? Today we're going to build a MDX blog using Remix and Tailwind. It's honestly going to take us probably 5 or 10 minutes. It's crazy how simple this is. As you can see on the left here, we're sourcing the content of the blog post from a Markdown file. So it's a very nice and simple way to write blog posts. And as you can see on the right side, as far as styling goes, it looks pretty decent. You can see we got syntax highlighting, which I'll show you how to do. And generally the typography and everything looks really nice. And all of this honestly is coming from like a single class from Tailwind, which is amazing. And I'll show you how to do that in a little bit. Once we're done with all of this, I'm also going to show you how to deploy this to Vercel. And you'll see how crazy it is that you can basically build a new blog from scratch in like 10 minutes or less. Alright, so if you want to follow along and you do want to deploy to Vercel, like we're doing here, I recommend creating a new repository in GitHub and then clone that down. I've already done that, and you can see I just have an empty repository here, and we're going to add some initial code. You can also see that I'm using Node 16 and npm 8. Alright, so to get started, we're going to do npx create remix at latest. It might ask you that it needs to install something. Just hit yes here. Now it's going to ask us where would we like to create our application. Since we're already working off of an existing directory, which I cloned from my GitHub repository, I'm just going to do a / here to say that, hey, just use my existing location. And then it's going to ask you, where do you want to deploy? As you can see, you've got a bunch of different selections here. Like I said, we're going to use Vercel. You can obviously try to do these other ones, but if you want to follow along, you can go ahead and select Vercel. So we'll select Vercel here, and then we'll do TypeScript. And yes, I want to do an npm install. Alright, and when that finishes installing, as you can see, we now have a bunch of different directories and files in here. Next, let's go ahead and start our application using npm run dev. You should see that it starts at localhost 3000. And if you open that up, you should see something like this in the right. You know, it's a very basic page with just some links in it. You can see that that's being rendered from this index.tsx within routes, which is sort of our root route. Now, we don't really need all of this, so I'm just going to clean up and delete all of these links. And, you know, maybe let's just change this to my blog. Now, hopefully you already know a little bit about how routing works in Remix. If you don't, if you're a complete beginner, I do have a crash course on Remix in the channel that would probably be good to check out. But from that video, you'll learn that routing in Remix is really file-based. And, you know, just like how you can create route modules using JavaScript, it actually has support for using MDX files as a route module. So we're going to be able to very easily create within this routes directory. We're going to create a new, let's call this directory blog. And within here, let's create a new MDX file called firstpost.mdx. Now we can go ahead and just actually start writing stuff in here. I'm going to put in some dummy text like hello world. And then on the right, you'll notice that if we go to /blog/firstpost, there's our hello world. So you're already honestly 90% of the way there. You can just keep writing into this, right? And you already have an MDX blog within the first 2 minutes of us putting this together. But obviously this is you know, we could add a little bit more styling, make it a little bit better. And ideally you have a list of articles in your application so that, you know, you have some kind of directory on your site. But before we do that, let's learn a little bit about how you can utilize some attributes. So you might be familiar with in Markdown how you can add attributes at the top like this. Now, for example, let's add a title and a date. And these attributes, you can actually access them within the Markdown itself. So for example, if I change this to attributes.title, you'll see on the right here that changed it to the title that we have here. And I can also access the date, and it actually turns it into a date object. So we can also do toDate string to display that nicely, and you'll see Saturday, January 15th over here. I believe the date actually is in UTC though, so that's why it's a little bit off. I'm recording this in January 16th, but for example, I think if we change this to UTC string, you'll see that it'll print, you know, Sunday, January 16th, 2022. So that's just something to watch out for there. All right, and then the other thing is, you might have learned from my crash course or in the documentation of Remix that you can provide a meta function usually, right, in route modules. And one of the things you can do with the meta function is be able to change the title of the page here. So you can see right now it just says new remix app. If we add some meta here, this acts the same way as the meta function in a typical route module in Remix. So this actually accepts, a couple different properties. For example, you can do title, and let's just copy this over here, right? And that's gonna change the title up here. So again, it works exactly like the meta function in a typical route module. So really, what we're doing here is we just have a route module, but it's just in Markdown, right? All right, so that's just a quick intro to some attributes that you can add to your Markdown. What I'm gonna go ahead and do here is I'm just gonna paste a post that I've written previously so that we have some examples of, various headings and text and some code blocks. You can see that we don't have syntax highlighting yet, so we're gonna work on that soon. And then, like I said, ideally, if we go to /blog, ideally we have a page here that maybe is listing out each of our blog posts, right? So why don't we first work on some syntax highlighting? I think that's something that would immediately make this page a little bit more readable with the code blocks, as you can see here. So let's quickly talk about what are the tools you can use to do syntax highlighting in an app like this. Generally, most people you'll see are using either Prism or Highlight.js. They're honestly mostly the same. There might be some slight performance differences, but honestly, pick one of these and it'll work. The nice thing with either of these solutions is that they generally come with a bunch of themes that you can just bring right in, so you don't even have to worry about styling too much. So you can see that, you can very easily change the themes here, right? Same thing with Highlight. Highlight has a bunch of predefined CSS that you can pull in. Now, how we're going to achieve syntax highlighting is through the use of plugins. And if you've never worked with MDX before, the gist of it is that you imagine that we're transforming Markdown into HTML, right? That's really what's happening behind the scenes. And with MDX, typically, you can sort of hook into that transformation and manipulate it a little bit using plugins. And generally, there's two types of plugins that you can use, either remark plugins or rehype plugins. All right, so for our case, we're going to go ahead and install a rehype plugin. I'm going to stop my application and I'm going to install rehype highlight, which again is a rehype plugin using Highlight.js. Once we have that installed, we're going to open up remix.config.js and we're just going to add some configuration in here. You should be able to add an MDX key, which allows you to hook into that plugin system to add in your own custom plugins. In our case, we are importing rehype highlight, and then we're going to add that to our list of rehype plugins. And again, if you were to use a remark plugin, you can also add remark plugins in here like this and install other things, but we're going to keep it simple with our rehype highlight. All right, with that plugin in place, what we're going to do next here is we're going to create a layout route, which is, if you've seen my crash course, it's really just the same name as a folder. So for example, if we did blog.tsx here, notice that it's at the same level as the folder that's also called blog. This basically tells Remix that, hey, this file is a layout route. Whatever we include in here, for example, any CSS or styling is going to be styling that's going to be used in the entire nested routes of blog. And the reason we're doing this is I want to be able to bring in the CSS from Highlight.js, and specifically one of the themes for the code that we're going to use. So I'm going to paste in here the CSS GitHub dark dimmed. There's a couple different ones. If you look inside the Highlight.js folder in your node modules, you'll see that there's a styles folder in here, and there's a bunch of other themes in here that you can use. Or for example, like there's one, like Atom 1 dark and etc. dark. There's GitHub dark dimmed, foundation. It's really up to you how you want your code to look. In my case, I'm selecting GitHub dark dimmed. So what we need to do is to be able to allow the CSS to be exposed to all of our blog routes. And the way we do that in Remix is through the links function like this. All right, so make sure to import links function if you want that TypeScript type from Remix. And then we're just providing a style sheet with the href of this imported CSS. And then since this is the acting layout route for everything inside our blog folder. That also means that we need to export a default component in here that is returning an outlet. All right, from here, let's go ahead and see what our application looks like so far. I'm gonna go ahead and rerun our application, npm run dev. And just like that, if you open up your first post again, you should be able to start seeing syntax highlighting, right? Very little work. And if you're not familiar too much with the Markdown syntax, the way to do code blocks is basically just, your triple backticks and then the language and then putting your code in there. So you can see that here I have this JS hello world and it's turning into this thing on the right side here. All right, so with syntax highlighting, this is looking pretty decent already, but the overall styles of it is still very plain. It's not super great. And one of the challenges with a generated page like this, since this is generated from Markdown, is that it's not as straightforward to add various styling to, for example, a header like this. How do we add styles to this, for example? And if you inspect the HTML, it's just a bunch of h3s and p tags. It would be nice if we can just automatically style this somehow. And I mentioned in the beginning that we're going to use Tailwind, and specifically we're going to bring in this typography plugin, which allows us to use a single prose class, and it's going to automatically style our entire page. As you can see in the example here, if you just provide class prose and then provide your rendered Markdown HTML, it's going to automatically produce some nice default styles for us. So back in the code, I'm going to kill the running application, and I'm just going to install some basic configuration to get our Tailwind up and running. So I'm going to do npm install -d Tailwind CSS, and then I'm also going to use concurrently, and I'll explain that in a second here. And then since we said we're going to use this typography plugin, I'm also going to install @Tailwind CSS /typography. All right, so install those three things. All right, once installed, we're going to go into the root of our files, and we're going to add a Tailwind configuration file in here. It's just going to be tailwind.config.js. And we're just going to add some basic configuration in here. We're going to tell it which content it should be sort of paying attention to in terms of, what are things that's being styled in our application. And then the important piece here is to add in the plugin that we also installed for typography. Next, in package.json, we're going to have to manipulate our dev and build scripts here to take into account that we're using Tailwind. So I'm going to change that to this, which you can just see that now we have a build CSS and a dev CSS, which is simply running Tailwind and creating that Tailwind file. And then for the regular build, we just need to make sure that we run that build CSS so that when we deploy, we're making sure that that CSS is being built. And by the way, this is fairly well documented in the Remix documentation for Tailwind. So if you feel like I'm going a little bit fast, this is exactly what's documented here. So just make sure to follow along here. And you'll notice that what we need to do next is in the root.tsx, we need to import those styles. So in root.tsx, I'm going to import that Tailwind CSS that's being generated for us. And then I'm going to add a new links function in here. And we're just going to register that style as a style sheet. Now, if you run your application at this point, if you do npm run dev, you'll see that that dev CSS script that we added to create that Tailwind CSS file is going to run. And you might see an error with the Tailwind CSS file not being there yet, because initially it's not there yet, right? But you will see it being created, and eventually it's sort of it'll resolve itself. All right, so now that we have Tailwind in place, we're going to open up blog.tsx, which remember is a layout route. Any style that you define in here effectively affects all of our blog posts, everything that's inside this blog folder. So it's a wrapper of sorts, right? So if we, for example, wrap our outlet with some basic styles from Tailwind, it's going to affect the styling of all of our blog posts. So I'm actually going to do exactly that. I'm going to wrap the outlet with just the prose class from that plugin that we installed, and then I'm just going to center it. And with that added, you'll notice that our blog post now looks like this, which honestly is pretty incredible looking, in my opinion, for it's really just this one prose class that we added right here. All right, so pretty much you can just add, if you wanted to try a second post. Let's do second post dot MDX, and we can do title, hello world again. And if we take a look in blog slash second post, there you go. You can add some syntax, some code, right? So that kind of just shows that our styles works, regardless of whatever blog post you're in. All right, next thing we're gonna do is, ideally, like I said in slash blog, we maybe list out our blog posts. Again, ideally you already know some fundamentals of how routing works in Remix, but as you can see, right, each of these files are acting as paths to slash blog. Now, if we wanted to sort of add a custom page for just slash blog, all we need to do is create an index in here, which is gonna match that slash blog exactly. So we're gonna do index.tsx, and I'm gonna start exporting a default component here. I'm gonna call this blog index, and let's go ahead and just render something, and you'll see it'll say to do list articles, right? So at this point, all we need to do is load in each of our posts and make a list. Now, the interesting thing with MDX routes in Remix is you can actually import the entire module as well as the underlying attributes within it using a simple import statement like this. So if you were to do first post from firstpost.mdx, and let's also do second post, what we can do is we can use a simple utility. This is actually from the documentation as well, so I'm just copying it, but we can use the simple utility to take a module and pull out sort of the slug, so basically the path without the .mdx path name in it, and then we can just provide the rest of the attributes that we're getting from that meta, which you can use to display the title and stuff as well on slash blog. And then remember, in Remix we use the loader function to load in data server side. So if we add each of our modules in here, so I'll add the first post and the second post, and you'll know that whatever we return in here is accessible in the client via use loader data, so which is a hook like this, which we are going to import from Remix, and a little bit of JSX added here, and we can go ahead and just create a basic list of each of our articles. And you can see that we can utilize the title that we provide. So in my second post, for example, let me add a meta in here, and let me just copy this over, and let's do description. And you can see that's updating on the right side here because we're printing out the title and the description, and then we're using the link function so that we can actually navigate to each of those pages using the slug, right? So if I click on my first post, it'll go to that post that we've been working on, and same thing on the second post. All right, and that's pretty much it as far as work goes. To be able to list out an article, render an article, have it be decently styled, and have syntax highlighting. That's it. That's all the work that you need to do. Obviously, you can further improve this and personalize it yourself. Ideally, maybe you have some kind of nav bar like I had in the beginning in the base route here. Ideally, put in your own personal landing page. But we're just going to leave it at this and keep it pretty simple. This is really the goal that we're trying to achieve, is your most basic, minimal, reasonably good looking blog post. That's what we're trying to achieve. So let's talk about how we can go ahead and deploy this. Now remember, I said that this was a Git repo that I already created and that we're going to deploy this to Vercel. So I'm going to go ahead and push this. So I'm just going to do a commit here and a push. Now it's in my repo in GitHub. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to go to vercel.com and we're going to do login. If you don't already have an account, you can do a sign up. Once you're logged in, you'll see a page like this, and you can select new project, and then you might need to adjust your permissions so that it can see that specific repo that you created. So for example, in my case, I'm only giving permissions to select repositories. Like I have this personal site that I'm trying to build, and then I'm just gonna add that new Remix site that we just built. So the Remix MDX blog example, and that should show up in your list here. So I'm gonna go ahead and click import, and provide a project name, and you'll see that it asks for a framework preset. It should already know that it's a Remix application, but if it doesn't, make sure to select Remix there. And this is because we selected Remix when we first created the application earlier. And then just click deploy. You can see that it's immediately going to start building for you, and it'll say congratulations, you deployed, you got some confetti. Let's go ahead and go to our dashboard for this, and you'll see a visit button. Let's click on that, and now our blog is deployed. Obviously we don't have that landing page, so let's just go to /blog, which will see our list of articles and my first post, right? So honestly, if you subtract all the time I spent talking in this video, everything that we've done so far to create an MDX blog as well as deploying, you could probably do this whole thing in 5 minutes or less. Now you might be wondering, what's the workflow for adding a new post, right? Well, basically you just go back into your code base and create a new post. So let's do third post, and let me just copy this over, and we'll just update the title here just so we know it's a different page, right? And then remember to add to your list of posts. So add our post here, and let's do add post from module here, third post, and then we just deploy. Commit, push, and you'll see that Vercel will pretty much watch your repository for changes. So you can see here that it's already building my commit there. And I did push to the main branch. You could also push to, a separate dev branch if you want to deploy to perhaps like a preview route, which Vercel also does for you, which is really nice. So you can kind of think of the main branch or the master branch as your production. And once that completes, if you refresh your page, it should be pretty quick, and you'll see your third post there. All right, so that pretty much sums up this video. It's very simple, right? The only thing that's, I'll admit, is not super great about the solution is you have to keep manually updating this blog list. But again, for something that you just stand up for, 10 minutes or less, I think it's pretty reasonable, especially if you're just getting started with blogging. There obviously is more advanced ways to pull this off. Like, for example, if you take a look at Kenzie Dodd's blog/website, it's actually with Remix, and he has a much more complex solution where I believe he's using the GitHub API to get a list of his Markdown posts, and then he transforms that on the fly and then caches it in Redis or something like that. So much more complicated, but again, you can evolve this from something simple like this to something more complex like Kent's, based on what your needs are. All right, that's the end of this tutorial. Hopefully you like that one. If you got any feedback from me, let me know in the comments. And if this seemed a little bit too advanced for you and you're just trying to get started with Remix, make sure to check out my crash course on Remix. With that said, hope you have a great day, and I'll see you on the next one.